Major Cowardice, Minor Cowardice, and Weakening Enchant are debuffs that reduce enemies' weapon and spell damage. In the past, based on rather limited testing, I've been saying that Major Cowardice 430 weapon and spell damage reduction translates to 11% reduced damage done when it came to PvE enemies. But upon further testing, depending on the specific enemy, Major Cowardice could translate to as little as 7% damage reduction, or as much as 30%. In this video we'll find out how useful Major and Minor Cowardice debuffs really are. Let's get back to the beginning so everyone knows what I'm talking about. There are 3 debuffs that reduce enemies' weapon and spell damage in the game. First one is Minor Cowardice, a debuff that reduces enemies' weapon and spell damage by 215, and comes from 3 sources: Warden's Corrupting Pollen skill, Nightblade's Power Extraction skill, and the Healing Mage 5-piece item set. Only the skills are viable sources, as it's absolutely not worth it to sacrifice a 5-piece item set slot just for Minor Cowardice. The Nightblade skill applies it for 10 seconds, so it's better if Nightblade does it. But if you don't have one, Warden could also do that. But their skill only applies it for 6 seconds, and competes with its morph, because by deciding to run Corrupting Pollen, you're giving up Budding Seeds, which does decent healing. Major Cowardice works the same, but is twice as strong. It reduces enemies' weapon and spell damage by 430, and comes from 4 sources: Nightblade's Aspect of Terror skill, and its morphs, Killmarsher Cruelty's 5-piece item set, Nyx's Hound Howl's 5-piece item set, and Vykosa monster set. Only the Aspect of Terror and Vykosa are viable options. Killmarsher's Cruelty would be way too unreliable, and the uptime we'd get from Nyx's Hound's Howl would be really low. Mass Hysteria is the preferred morph of Aspect of Terror, as it removes the cap on enemies that can be affected. The Nightblade skill applies it for 10 seconds and can be kept up at all times, which is why Vykosa is never the ideal option, but it is an option if you don't really care about optimizing your group, and you don't have a Nightblade support. Then there's the Weakening, which is an enchant you can put on your weapon. Its value on a 200 weapon is 348, and with the infused trait it goes up to 452. And this is the value you'll be getting out of it most of the time. Infused Weakening is usually provided by the healers. It technically can be boosted up to 807, with Toruk's Pact and Heartland Conqueror 5-piece item sets, but it's just not worth it. But all these numbers aren't really saying much, because you don't know how much weapon damage any given boss has. Is the 430 weapon damage reduction going to be a significant amount that will reduce the damage by like half, or is it going to be a tiny fraction of their weapon damage? Well, there's a way to test that. For that we'll have to take a hit from a boss without any weapon damage reductions, and then take another hit with those weapon damage reductions applied. Take this testing I did on Ohms on normal difficulty as an example. I took 6671 damage, then I applied both Major and Minor Cowardice, which add up to 645 weapon damage reduction, and it reduced Ohm's damage down to 5564, which is a 16.59% damage reduction compared to the original hit. Based on that, we can conclude that 645 is 16.59% of Ohm's weapon damage, so 100% of it is 3886.9. I made this spreadsheet where I've stored testing data of some of the bosses, and by ticking these checkboxes at the top, you can control what amount of weapon damage reduction you'd like to see in the damage reduction column. And when I tick all the boxes for a total of 1452 weapon damage reduction, you'll notice that there is one boss whose weapon damage is so ridiculously low, it's possible to remove all of it. Chief Ozozai on normal difficulty, who's the second boss in Fungal Grotto 1. So I decided to test it and see what would happen if I reduce his weapon damage to 0. And well, his attacks deal no damage. They don't even register in combat metrics. It's as if they didn't exist, but the heavy attack still will knock you back. Now let's go back to the table. Next conclusion that we have to draw is that all bosses have different amounts of weapon damage depending on the difficulty mode, so it's less effective in Veteran. You'll notice that there is no hard mode versions in this table, and that's because for every boss I've tested, hard mode did not increase boss's weapon damage, and it had the same value as the Veteran version. Next conclusion we can draw from that is that bosses in dungeons have on average less weapon damage than trial bosses. For example, Cowardice, the first boss in Balsunar dungeon, has only 3679 weapon damage in the Veteran and hard mode versions. So a Nightblade healer on their own could reduce his damage down by almost 30%, which is a significant amount. The same weapon damage reduction against Saint Ohms the Just would translate to only 18.42% reduced damage done. Here you can take a look at the table with Major Cowardice, Minor Cowardice, and 200 Infused Weakening selected, which will be the most common setup. And here you can have a look with all possible weapon damage reductions applied, which is unlikely to happen. Another thing I have to mention is that these weapon damage reductions have increasing returns. Once again on Kovan's example, let's say you're applying the usual major cowardice, minor cowardice, and 200 weakening with infused trait. That's 1097 weapon damage reduction, which translates to 29.82% reduced damage done. Now let's say you're considering adding Toruk's Pact and Heartland Conqueror on top of that. These would add another 355 weapon damage reduction, which is 9.6% of Kovan's total weapon damage. So the damage done reduction would go from 29.82% to 39.47%. But looking at it and thinking, adding Toruk's Pact and Heartland Conqueror will reduce Kovan's damage by another 9.6% is wrong. We're comparing a situation where Kovan's damage was reduced by 29.82%, so he was doing 70.18% of his original damage, and a situation where Kovan's damage was reduced by 39.47%, so he was doing 60.53% of his original damage. When you compare these two, we are going from 70.18% down to 60.53%. So the damage reduction you'd actually notice from adding these two sets would be 13.75%. Now I'm not saying you should sacrifice two 5-piece item set slots to get a bit more damage reduction, especially since Kovan's most deadly mechanic deals HP based damage and won't be affected by weapon damage reductions. But this interaction happens also when you already have weakening and you're considering adding major and minor cowardice on top of that. As in, these cowardices will be worth more because of increasing returns, because you already had weakening enchant. The example of Toruk's Pact and Heartland Conqueror was just easier to work with due to much higher numbers. Now let's move on to another thing. Max HP based damage. Let's use Scrivener's Hall's first boss as an example now. Reducing Riftmaster Nakuri's weapon damage actually wouldn't be that useful, because most of the damage in that fight is based on your max HP, and reducing weapon damage doesn't affect it. So major cowardice, weakening, etc. would affect Riftmaster's light attacks, heavy attacks, or the Book Tornado, but not the Codexas that are constantly dealing damage. It's another thing you have to keep in mind. Weapon damage reductions won't be that useful in fights with lots of max HP based damage, such as Riftmaster Nakuri we just talked about, or Basai and Rogrove. But debuffs that reduce weapon and spell damage aren't the only ways to reduce enemies' damage done. There's also major and minor Maim, which reduce enemies' damage done by 10 and 5% respectively. How do these fit into this equation? It's very simple because they're applied after weapon damage reductions. So let's say you used weapon damage reduction to reduce boss's damage done by 30%, and his attacks now deal 7000 damage instead of 10,000. Major Maim will start working from that point, so it will reduce the 7000 by 10% down to 6300. Major and minor Maim are additive, which means that when they're both applied, they aren't applying a 10% reduction first and then a 5% one. They together apply a 15% damage reduction. Also, major and minor Maim do work on max HP based damage. And that's it for this video. I hope that after watching it you'll understand everything about how reducing enemies' damage done works in ESO. But if you have any more questions, feel free to ask in the comments, or in our community Discord Wildheart. Especially if on top of the questions you'd like to discuss it with other like-minded players. I'll leave a link to this spreadsheet in the description, so you can take a look yourself. Thanks for watching and see you next time.